Ready to talk fashion? Today we're taking a deep dive into corsets and crinolines.
And trust me, it's way more interesting than you might think.
We're going to be exploring an 1868 book called The Corset and the Crinoline.
A book of modes and costumes from remote periods to the present time by WBL.
It's perfect for anyone who loves the history of fashion, especially corsets.
Or crinolines. And for folks who like to dress authentically for historical reenactment, we'll be talking about some details that can really elevate the authenticity of your outfits.
So, if you're listening in your car or while you're sewing, get ready to take some notes because we're covering a lot of ground today.
Definitely. And one of the first things the book tackles is this idea that corsets have been around for ages.
Not just, a Victorian invention.
Right, exactly. That wasn't something that just popped up in the 1800s.
I've always thought of corsets as like a mainly European thing, but the book mentions them being used all over the world.
Oh, yeah, for sure. They talk about waist-cinching garments in ancient cultures.
Like where?
Well, the book specifically mentions the inhabitants of Palenque, which is in the Eastern Archipelago.
Never heard of it.
Me neither. But it just shows how widespread this practice was.
Okay, so Palenque. Got it.
And they also talk about people from Ceylon, Circassians, Crimean Tartars.
Wow, all over the place.
Yeah, and even in India and Persia, the Hindus and Persians, they were doing things to cinch their waists.
Makes you wonder, right? Like, if so many different cultures have been doing this for so long, maybe it's like a human thing,
Yeah.
This desire for a small waist.
It really does make you think, like, is it instinctual or cultural or maybe a bit of both?
But then the book brings up China, and it's like a totally different story.
Right. So they valued small waists too, but their focus was on foot binding, not corsetry.
Yeah, which is like a whole other conversation. But why the difference,
Sure.
Why did one culture go for corsets and the other for foot binding?
It's a good reminder that beauty standards are relative, and what's considered attractive in one culture can be totally different in another.
For sure.
Yeah.
And we can't project our modern ideas onto the past when we're trying to understand those historical choices.
Exactly. Like, the book even mentions this Chinese gentleman, Wu Tanjin, who visited England in the 1840s.
Okay, what happened?
He was, like, completely blown away by how tightly laced the English ladies were.
It was like a whole new world of beauty standards for her.
Exactly. Totally foreign to his own cultural experiences.
Okay, so we've got this global perspective on waist cinching, but let's focus in on Europe now.
Sounds good.
The book takes us through the evolution of corsets starting way back in the Middle Ages.
Those early forms are really interesting, like those stiff bodices called cote hardies they had in 9th century France.
So it's Hardy's. Okay, I'm writing that down.
Yeah, they were all about that slim waistline even back then.
So it's not like corsets were this sudden invention. They evolved over time, building on those earlier garment styles.
For sure. And then there's this amazing little tidbit from a manuscript from 1043.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What is it?
There's a demon in it, and guess what? The demon is wearing a corset.
Wait, a demon wearing a corset?
I know, right? It's probably meant to be satire, The monks who made the manuscript were poking fun at women's fashion.
Even back then, they were debating fashion choices.
But it's still funny to picture a demon all laced up in a corset.
Definitely. And get this, corsets weren't just for women back then. The book mentions men wearing them, too.
Well, yeah. There's a household record from 1265 that actually mentions buying whalebone for men's corsets.
Men in corsets. That's not something you see every day.
It's so interesting how our ideas about gender and clothing have changed so much.
So we've got demons, we've got men. Who else was wearing corsets back in the day?
Well, in England, there was this garment called a kirtle, which was like a close-fitting bodice.
Okay, I've heard of kirtles.
But here's the thing. Wearing a kirtle on its own without anything over it could actually signify that you were a servant.
Really? Like a uniform almost?
Yeah. Or it could even be a form of penance.
Like a punishment?
Exactly. The book gives the example of Jane Shore, who was forced to wear a kirtle as penance.
Wow. So clothing could carry a lot of social meaning back then.
Yeah, it wasn't just about fashion. It was about your status, your identity, even your morality.
It makes you think about how we use clothing today to express ourselves.
Right, absolutely. Like, we might not have those same strict rules, but clothing still sends messages about who we are and how we want to be perceived.
Okay, so let's jump ahead a few centuries now to the 16th century.
The era of Catherine de' Medici.
Now, she was serious about those small waists, right?
Oh, yeah, she was like the queen of tight lacing.
I read that she popularized these super restrictive corsets called core.
Yep. Those were designed to cinch the waist down to like 13 inches.
13 inches. That's tiny.
I know, it's hard to even imagine.
And it wasn't just about being tight. They even wore steel covers over their corsets,
Not to compress further, but to make it perfectly smooth.
like a sculpted armor, not just underwear.
Exactly. It shows how committed they were to achieving that ideal shape.
It's interesting how that idea of shaping the body pops up in other fashion trends too, like with Queen Elizabeth and her huge ruffs.
Oh yeah, those ruffs were massive. They visually minimized the waist, even though they weren't actually compressing the body.
And around the same time, you have the Venetians with their elaborate gowns that also played with proportion to accentuate a small waist.
It's like all these different cultures were finding their own ways to achieve that same aesthetic goal.
And of course, you had the critics back then too. The book mentions Philip Stubbs, who had some pretty strong opinions about Elizabethan fashion.
He was like a 16th century fashion blogger railing against the excesses of ruffs and other trends.
So some things never change. People have always been fascinated by and also a little bit critical of fashion trends.
For sure. It's part of the fun.
Okay, so we've journeyed through the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Now let's step into the 18th century, the era of Louis VI.
Ooh, the age of elegance.
What's happening with corsets in fashion in this time period?
Well, the tight-fitting bodices over corsets are still in style, but the materials and construction get even more intense.
Like, how so?
They were using thick leather for corsets, sometimes the stuff called bend, which was incredibly stiff.
So not very comfy, I imagine.
Probably not. But then you have this interesting shift with the French Revolution.
Right. Everything gets a little looser, more relaxed.
Yeah. You see the rise of these looser garments called jumps, kind of like modern-day jumpers.
It's almost like a fashion rebellion against the stiffness of the previous era.
Definitely. But here's the thing. Those periods of looser clothing often lead to a resurgence of corsetry later on.
It's like a fashion pendulum, swinging back and forth.
Exactly. So once the dust settles from the revolution, corsets make a big comeback.
Makes sense. So what happens in the 19th century? Do corsets get even more extreme?
They sure do. By 1810, the writer Buchan is observing this revival of tight lacing, and the materials are getting even crazier.
Okay, spill the tea. What are they using?
Iron and steel. Can you imagine?
Ouch. That sounds pretty intense.
Oh. And the pressure to conform was huge. The book even mentions mothers using their foot to tighten their daughters' corsets.
Wow. That's a bit much, even for fashion.
But it's important to remember that alongside those extreme practices, there were also more moderate approaches.
So it wasn't all about squeezing waist to the point of fainting.
Right. They talk about using backboards and stocks in combination with corsets, not necessarily for tight lacing, but to help young ladies develop good posture.
So it was like a combination of fashion and like etiquette training.
Exactly. And even back then, they were having debates about the health implications of corsets.
It's like the same conversation we're still having today.
Right. Some medical professionals defended moderate corset use, arguing that they could provide support for the back.
So it wasn't all negative, at least from some perspectives.
Definitely. And here's another twist that might surprise you. Men were still wearing corsets in the 18th century.
What? Seriously?
Yeah, often for back support, but sometimes purely for fashion to get that streamlined look.
So even while women were getting laced into these tight corsets, some men were participating in the trend too.
It really challenges our assumptions about the history of corsetry.
For sure. So we've talked about corsets, but what about crinolines?
Yes, the iconic bell-shaped skirts.
Before we get to those, the book points out that the term crinoline itself is older than we might think.
It actually refers to horsehair stiffening that was used in skirts way before those cage crinolines came along.
So even those seemingly simple full skirts of the 18th century had their own secrets.
Exactly. And it's interesting to think about how that desire for a wider silhouette pops up in different cultures, too.
Like where?
Well, the book compares the widespread skirts of 18th century Europe with those worn by the South Sea Islanders.
Interesting. So maybe that preference for a wider base to the silhouette is a more universal aesthetic?
Could be. And there were definitely people who defended the fashion.
Like who?
Well, Madame Lasant, for example, argued that crinolines actually helped accentuate a small waist.
It's all about illusion, isn't it? Playing with proportions to create a certain look.
For sure. And we can't talk about crinolines without going back to the early 18th century.
When those hooped petticoats were all the rage.
Exactly. Mrs. Selby is credited with inventing them.
There's even a satirical poem from that time, The Farthingale Reviewed, which pokes fun at this new fashion.
People were a little bit scandalized by the hoops, but, change can be scary, especially when it comes to fashion.
And of course, innovation never stops.
Mm-hmm.
The book mentions the Zephyrina Jupon, a new type of crinoline designed by Thompson & Co.
What's special about that one?
It had an open front, which was supposed to be more comfortable than those earlier versions.
Oh, interesting. So comfort was already a consideration back then. It wasn't all about suffering for fashion.
That's good to hear. I'm looking forward to diving into more of these details as we go deeper into the book.
Me too. There's so much more to uncover. And the book really emphasizes this idea that the desire for a small waist was like a universal thing.
Not just a passing fad.
Exactly. They present it as this ongoing quest throughout history, this desire to shape and mold the waistline.
And it makes me think, if achieving that shape required some form of corsetry, maybe these garments would have emerged regardless of the specific fashion trends.
That's a really interesting point. It's like maybe it's not just about conforming to a certain style, but something deeper about our perception of beauty.
Yeah, maybe there's something about the human form, something about the waist specifically, that draws us to this idea of a sculpted shape.
And this brings us back to the whole debate about corsets and health.
Right, because they weren't exactly known for being, the most comfortable thing in the world.
The book presents a lot of different opinions on this.
Like what?
Well, some critics blame corsets for all sorts of health problems like, spinal curvature and breathing difficulties.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But then you have others who actually defend corsets as being good for posture and back support.
So it's like reading those online forums today, where everyone's got a different opinion.
Totally. But what I found really interesting was that they included letters from women who actually wore corsets.
And what do they say?
They swore by them. They claim they didn't experience any discomfort or ill effects.
So it's like those personal experiences sometimes get lost in all the debates and judgments.
Exactly. It reminds us that these were real women making choices about their bodies and how they wanted to present themselves.
And we have to remember, this was all happening before modern corsetry. With all the advancements in materials and construction techniques.
Oh, totally. Those early corsets were a whole different beast. Imagine trying to wear one of those stiff leather corsets from the 1700s.
No, thank you.
Oh.
But speaking of judgments, the author throws in this kind of cheeky statistic.
Oh, yeah, what was that?
They point out that despite all the supposed dangers of corsetry, the female population actually exceeded the male population at the time.
It's like they're saying, hey, if corsets are so deadly, how come there are more women than men?
It's a good point. Though, obviously, correlation doesn't equal causation.
But it's a fun little detail.
Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty of how these corsets were actually made.
All right, let's talk construction. The book goes into some pretty fascinating details about the techniques and materials they use.
Especially for folks who are into historical costuming. This is like gold.
Totally. For starters, they compare those super rigid corsets from the past with the more flexible figure molding corsets that were popular in their time, the 1860s.
So even within the 19th century, there were big changes happening in corset design.
Definitely. And they talk about specific design elements, like the shift from those steel covers we mentioned earlier to what they call stomacher corsets.
Stomacher corsets? What are those?
They were basically corsets that combine the support of, a traditional corset with the decorative element of a stomacher.
So it was both functional and fashionable.
Oh, exactly. And they mention a specific corset maker, Thompson & Co., who were known for their innovative designs.
Like what?
They had this thing called the glove-fitting corset, which was supposed to mold to the body like a second skin.
Sounds pretty high-tech for the 1860s.
Right. It shows how skilled those corset makers were.
So what about front-fastening corsets? Those are pretty popular today. What did they think of those back then?
They weren't big fans.
Really? Why not?
They thought they lacked the stability and shaping power of a traditional corset.
Oh, interesting.
They even called them imperfect and faulty in every way.
Ouch. I guess those 19th century corset makers had strong opinions.
But you have to remember, this was 1868. Front-fastening corsets were a new thing.
So they were probably comparing them to those traditional corsets that had been around for centuries.
Exactly. But it's funny how things change, right? Now, front-fastening corsets are totally normal.
It's a good reminder that even something as seemingly simple as a corset has this whole history of innovation and evolution.
And the book really stresses the importance of proper fit and construction when it comes to corsets.
Makes sense. You don't want a flimsy corset.
They warn against poorly made garments, saying that a good corset should be supportive and comfortable.
I mean, that's good advice for anyone who wears corsets today.
Absolutely. And they talk about how to achieve a more natural-looking, gradually tapered waist.
So not like those extreme 13-inch waists we talked about earlier.
Right. They suggest starting corset training at a young age with corsets that are snug but not overly tight.
So it's about shaping the body over time, not forcing it into some unnatural shape.
And they emphasize the importance of good posture and exercise alongside corset wear.
So it's a more holistic approach, recognizing that fashion and health are connected.
They even talk about the psychological aspects of corsetry, how some women find the feeling of being tightly laced to be pleasurable. Yeah, it challenges the idea that corsets are just about oppression and suggests that they can be a source of personal satisfaction.
Like, maybe it's about feeling confident and in control of your body.
Exactly. It's all about individual experiences and how people choose to express themselves through fashion.
Now, this is where things get really interesting. The author compares the tightly laced waists of fashionable ladies to foot binding in China.
It's a bold comparison.
But they're not condoning either practice, right?
No, not at all. They're using it to highlight the cultural relativity of beauty standards.
So basically, what one culture considers beautiful might seem extreme or even harmful to another culture.
Exactly. And for anyone who collects or wears historical clothing, it's important to keep that in mind.
We can't judge the past solely based on our modern values
We have to try to understand the cultural context behind these practices.
and appreciate the choices people made without necessarily agreeing with them.
Now, the author also talks about this idea that fashion is cyclical.
Like what goes around comes around.
Exactly. They say that periods of looser clothing are often followed by a return to tighter, more structured silhouettes.
Makes sense. It's like that fashion pendulum swinging back and forth.
And they suggest that this is why the 1860s, their present day, saw this resurgence of interest in tight lacing and those small waists.
So they are seeing this trend play out in their own time.
And it makes you think, like, is there something inherent in human nature, this tension between wanting to be comfortable and wanting to have a more sculpted, controlled body shape?
Yeah. And how fashion trends play into that.
But the author is also careful to point out the potential downsides of taking things too far.
Like, you can't just squeeze your waist down to nothing without any consequences.
They acknowledge that excessive tight lacing can be harmful to your health.
They even mention a case from the 1840s where a woman's waist was supposedly laced to only 22 inches.
They say it's probably an exaggeration, but it shows how much fascination and maybe anxiety there was around tight lacing.
Okay, so the author's not saying corsets are evil, but they're also not promoting those extreme practices.
Exactly. It's all about balance and finding what works for you.
Speaking of finding what works for you, the author talks about the corset industry in the 1860s.
Oh, yeah. What was going on then?
Well, custom-made corsets were all the rage, tailored to each individual's measurements.
So not just grabbing something off the rack.
Nope. But they also mention ready-made corsets were starting to become more available.
Oh, interesting. So like the early days of ready-to-wear.
And they talk about all the different materials and designs they had: silk, satin, cotton, something for every occasion and budget.
They even get into the different types of boning they use.
Like whalebone and steel.
Exactly. And how those materials affected the fit and shaping power of the corset.
That's good info for anyone who's interested in the technical side of corsetry.
Now, shifting gears to crinolines, the author traces their evolution from those early hooped petticoats to those cage crinolines we all know and love.
Those cage crinolines are so iconic. They really sum up Victorian fashion.
And they didn't just magically appear. The book talks about all the different materials they used, horsehair, steel hoops, and how they experimented with different shapes and volumes.
So much engineering went into these garments.
It's totally. And the shapes evolved over time, from those more modest bell shapes to those giant wide skirts that we associate with the mid-1800s.
It's funny to think that those early hooped petticoats were considered scandalous at the time, but then things just kept getting bigger and bolder.
And the author points out that crinolines weren't just about fashion.
Like, they had practical purposes, too.
Yeah, they helped lift those heavy skirts off the ground so they didn't get dirty.
That makes sense.
And they were more comfortable than wearing layers upon layers of petticoats.
So, fashion and function.
And we can't forget the social implications of those wide skirts.
They forced women to take up more space, literally.
It's like they were making a statement with their clothing.
But towards the end of the book, the author talks about the decline of the crinoline in the late 1860s.
Oh, yeah, what happened?
Well, those extreme wide shapes were getting impractical, even dangerous.
I can imagine.
There were reports of accidents and fires caused by those big skirts.
Yikes.
And new trends were starting to emerge, like the bustle, which offered a different way to shape the silhouette.
So it's like even the most popular fashion trends eventually fade away, making way for something new.
But that doesn't mean they're forgotten.
Definitely not. Those older styles continue to inspire designers and fashion enthusiasts today.
So it's a constant cycle of reinvention and reinterpretation.
And the author concludes with a message that's really important, I think, especially today.
What's that?
They talk about the importance of balance and moderation in fashion.
That makes sense.
Like the pursuit of beauty shouldn't come at the expense of your health and well-being.
It's a timeless message, really.
And they encourage readers to think about fashion holistically, not just focusing on the aesthetics, but also the comfort and practicality of clothing.
And how it makes you feel.
Exactly. So it's not just about what you wear, but why you wear it and how it fits into your life.
That's a great takeaway. I'm still amazed by how much we've uncovered about these garments.
Me too. And I think it's a good time now to kind of zoom out from all the historical details and think about what this all means for us today.
Especially for those of us who are really into historical fashion, like, what are the key takeaways? How can we apply all this knowledge?
Well, one big takeaway is just how much these garments were constantly changing.
They were just like one size fits all throughout history.
Exactly. The corsets from the 16th century were completely different from those worn in the 19th century, you know?
Same with the crinolines. Like, we talked about how that whole idea of a wider skirt evolved over time, from hoops to cages and all that.
So if you're trying to recreate a historical look, it's not enough to just find any old corset or crinoline.
You really have to understand the specifics of the time period.
Absolutely. And for folks who are into the technical side of things, like corset makers or costume historians, this book is a treasure trove.
We've seen how those corset makers were experimenting with different materials, boning techniques, closures, all that stuff.
It's like a whole lineage of craftsmanship that's still relevant today.
Even for people who wear corsets now, for fashion or waist training.
Totally. Understanding how they were made and worn back then can inform how we approach corsetry today.
Now, one thing that really stood out to me was that this pursuit of a slim waist wasn't just a Victorian thing.
It's like this recurring theme throughout history.
Yeah, we see it in ancient cultures, we see it in the 19th century, and it's still around today.
Whether it's corsetry or other kinds of restrictive garments, or even just like diet and exercise, that desire to shape the waistline seems to be pretty universal.
It makes you wonder about the psychology of it all, What is it about that specific part of the body that we're so focused on?
And for folks who are into historical reenactment, it's important to remember that getting the silhouette right often involves understanding these undergarments.
We can't just slap on a dress and call it a day.
You got to think about those foundational layers like the corset and the crinoline that really create the shape.
It's like building a house. You need a strong foundation to support everything else.
Now, this deep dive also challenged some of those assumptions we often make about corsets, like the idea that they were purely instruments of oppression.
It's more complicated than that.
Totally. While they were definitely used to enforce certain beauty standards and, in some cases, to restrict women's bodies, they were also seen as supportive garments.
And fashion statements.
Right. And even sources of personal pleasure for some women.
Remember those letters we talked about?
Yeah. Those women were like, hey, I actually enjoy wearing my corset.
It shows that the experience was really individual and varied, depending on the person, the context, all sorts of things.
So we can't just lump all corsets and all corset wearers into one category.
It's about acknowledging the complexity of the past and recognizing that people's experiences were diverse, even within something that seems restrictive like corsetry.
And it also highlights the fact that even garments that were once associated with oppression can be reclaimed and reinterpreted by individuals in ways that empower them.
It's like taking control of your own body and your own choices, regardless of what society tells you to do.
Absolutely. Now, another important takeaway is the need to understand the cultural context behind historical fashion.
What might seem shocking or extreme to us today was often considered normal, even beautiful back then.
Right. We can't judge the past solely through our modern lens.
Like, think about those steel corset covers. Those mothers using their foot to tighten their daughters' corsets.
It's easy to be like, oh my God, that's terrible. But we have to remember those practices were part of the accepted norms of their time.
It's about approaching historical fashion with sensitivity and respect, understanding that these garments were worn by real people.
people with their own beliefs and experiences that might be different from our own.
So it's about learning from the past without condoning practices that might be harmful by today's standards.
Exactly. It's about creating a more nuanced and inclusive understanding of fashion history.
So I guess the big question is, if restrictive clothing has been a part of human culture for so long, what does that say about our relationship with beauty standards and self-expression?
It's a big question, and it's one that we can keep asking as we continue to explore fashion, both past and present.
Well, that about wraps up our deep dive into corsets and crinolines. Thanks for joining us on this journey through fashion history.